I'm the Reverend Kerry Mueller, co-minister here at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Pottstown, a home of liberal religion, along with the Reverend Dave Hunter, who is entering now. Thank you. Who is our chalice lighter this morning? We light this chalice in honor of women's history, that what has been forgotten may be remembered to make us whole again. And our opening words are from Barbara Wells Tenhove. O spinner, weaver of our lives, your loom is love. May we who are gathered here be empowered by that love to weave new patterns of truth and justice into a web of life that is strong, beautiful, and everlasting. Our first hymn, and I wish we could sing it, but one day we will again. Our first hymn is Bread and Roses, which was long the anthem of the women's suffrage movement. To build a community for all. Here we gather, building on the gifts of all. This morning, the offering will be given and received. Thank you. Have you ever been to the Milwaukee airport? Anybody? Have you ever been through TSA at any airport? It's disorienting. In the Milwaukee airport, after you go through TSA, there is an area with benches, and it's labeled with a big sign saying recombobulation area. No. We are now going to recombobulate because thank you for finding an extra clicker for the flame. That worked. But in the process, I managed to forget announcements. So we will now call on Trish. Do you have an announcement for us?
Yes, I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be with you today, but I wanted to tell you that we will have people on Earth Day, April 23rd, in Reading at the concentrating on what climate change means for us. I'm sure it will be a wonderful day, and I hope you'll sign up for an hour or two to talk with people about registering to vote, about signing the petition to go 100% renewable by 2050, and to fix Harrisburg. So I'm sure we have been welcomed by many groups that have heard we will be there. So I hope they're going out, bring kids, enjoy a couple hours, talk to people.
Thank you,
In
Trish.
addition, in addition, we are planning a movie night, and the movie is a recent movie, and it should be very fun for you all. We chose April 9th in the evening. Bring your own dinner and snack while we're watching the movie, and then we'll have a conversation afterwards. It will add a little bit of urgency to your understanding of where we are in climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Trish. Earth Day becomes ever more important, especially when it's combined with voting registration. Are there other announcements this morning? Would you come to the microphone, please?
Good morning, I'm Miranda, and I want to thank people who have already put things in the basket for the Pottstown cluster, and invite anyone else that wants to put, let's see, it's bath towels or queen size and single sheets, either brand new or at least gently used and freshly laundered. I will be taking them is this the last Sunday of the month? No, right. So I will take them after the last Sunday, so you still have another week to bring them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Miranda. Are there other announcements? In that case, if the children would like to come forward, there are some rugs to sit on. And Dave, if you give me a hand, I'll come down to the... Is this microphone not working?
Hi, good morning, friends.
Oh, okay, thank you. Good morning.
We have a small crowd today.
A small crowd, but everyone is relevant. No, it's for me. Well, there are no little girls here today. Are there any older girls? Yes. You don't have to sit on the floor if you don't like, but I'd like to ask you, what do you wear to school? Jeans and a sweatshirt. Great. I'd like to ask the older ladies here today, what did you wear to school? Dresses. Skirts. Certainly my age, we were required to wear skirts every day to school. One of my classmates in 9th grade was sent home. It was a cold, snowy winter day, and she had about 1.5 miles to walk to school, and she wore snow pants to school that day. So they looked at her and they said, you have to go home and change to a skirt. Now, you were supposed to wear your snow pants under your skirt, but that's how it went. I wore a skirt that day because I was always a good girl. Not necessarily the best decision-making process in my life. When I preached in Arkansas 15 years ago, I thought, oh, well, this is Arkansas. Those old ladies are going to disapprove of me if I try to preach wearing pants, so I'll wear a skirt. And then I noticed that all those old ladies were wearing pants to church too, so I started doing that. But in 1850, which was really less than 100 years before I was born, women had to wear big ballooning skirts all the way to the floor. This cover shows one of those skirts and something else. Those skirts, they were not very convenient. If you were walking up the stairs with a baby in your arms and you had this big skirt all there, you could trip and both of you head down. Well, there was a young woman named Livy Miller who made herself a pair of puffy pants that she wore with a very short dress, sort of like the snow pants under the dress. Well, she got a lot of funny looks and some disapproval, but there was another lady named Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was an important lady in the women's voting rights actions. She liked them, so she made a pair for herself. They were much more practical. And then another woman saw them. Her name was Amelia Bloomer, and she wrote about them in her magazine. Well, at that point, hundreds of women started making these puffy pants for themselves. They called them bloomers. They were criticized, they made fun of them, but these women persisted, and they also promoted all kinds of rights for women, like voting. And eventually, women were allowed to vote. Now, if you think about 1943, when I was born, and women getting the vote in 1920, how many years is that? How many? 23. Can anyone think about what 23 years ago was? Was 1999?
Yes.
Right. 1999. For whom does that seem like it was very far away? Maybe the little kids don't remember it, but 1999 seems like yesterday to me.
That was about a week ago. Yeah.
That's when women got the vote. My mother was a girl at the time. Well, eventually bloomers went out of fashion, but we still haven't figured out all of the full working rights for women. And so we're working on equality for women. And today we're going to talk about a particular woman from the 19th century. So I thank you for your kind attention. If you want to, do you want to borrow these for class, or are you going to do something else?
I'm doing something else.
Okay, so did you have a chance to look at them? Thank you all very much, and if the children were to go on to their classes, and Dave helps me up to the pulpit, we'll do the next thing.
Can I just say that I think that, isn't today the first day of spring?
It is. It is the first day of spring.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about the first day of spring.
Great.
And maybe next week I'll repeat RE so that I don't have to plan another class. And I'll get to teach more kids about what the first day of spring means. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
It's okay.
Thank you. Did you know that Pope Francis has a Twitter account? He tweeted recently, "To pray is to bring the beating heart of current affairs into God's presence, so that God's gaze will shine out upon history." This becomes very clear to us all in this time, these days of anguish. What do we do when our hearts are breaking? When every night we see cities under siege, we see families mowed down while they're fleeing, when we hear pleas for help, when we see a maternity hospital destroyed, when we relive the years of the Cold War, when we hear a teenage Ukrainian refugee say, "Humanity is in crisis." What do we do when there is very little action that we can take as individuals? We do what humanity has always done. We turn to prayer for comfort, for courage, for the resolve to do what we can to alleviate this terrible suffering. So let me pause for a moment and pray for the people of Ukraine and all of Europe and the whole world, for life, for freedom, for sovereignty, for hope. Gracious God, God of many names, God beyond name, may we find the wisdom, the courage, and the strength to support the people of Ukraine, to move us all to a world of peace and justice, a world of beloved community for all. Be with us, God, when humanity is in crisis. Help us to end the killing, the destruction, the need to dominate, supremacy. This world needs every one of us, our talents, our thoughtfulness, our energy, our devotion, our full selves. We cannot afford to waste any life, not for the foolish reasons of race or gender or religion or whatever dividing line we may invent tomorrow. Let us reflect the hopeful energy of spring, send out our green shoots upon the world, and move towards a life of wholeness and strength and full humanity for all. Amen. The meditation hymn is number 123, Spirit of Life. Perhaps you will recall it. For a reading today, we have 14 short quotes by women about women. And I'd like to invite the readers to come forward. I've distributed them sort of randomly, and they're in random order, but if you all line up by the microphone and take turns until we get through all 14, that should be good.
You may not always have a comfortable life, and you will not always be able to solve all of the world's problems at once. But don't ever underestimate the importance you can have, because history has shown us that courage can be contagious and hope can take on a life of its own. Michelle Obama, American First Lady.
We still think of a powerful man as a born leader and a powerful woman as an anomaly. Margaret Atwood. I have the right of education. I have the right to play. I have the right to sing. I have the right to talk. I have the right to go to market. I have the right to speak up. Malala Yousafzai. Cautious, careful people, always casting about to preserve their reputation and social standing, never can bring about a reform. Those who are really in earnest must be willing to be anything or nothing in the world's estimation. Susan B. Anthony.
Great necessities call out great virtues. Abigail Adams.
Having family responsibilities and concerns just has to make you a more understanding person. Sandra Day O'Connor, first female U.S. Supreme Court Justice. We must not, in trying to think about how we can make a big difference, ignore the small daily difference we can make, which, over time, add up to big differences that we often cannot foresee. Marion Wright Edelman, activist, and once David Hunter's boss. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, activist.
promise yourself you are all you've got, Janis Joplin. I'd rather regret the things I've done than regret the things I haven't done, Lucille Ball. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent, Eleanor Roosevelt.
Until we get equality in education, we won't have an equal society. Sonia Sotomayor, Supreme Court Justice. In Iroquois society, leaders are encouraged to remember 7 generations in the past and consider 7 generations in the future when making decisions that affect the people. Wilma Mankiller, the first female chief of the Cherokee Nation. Feminism's agenda is basic. It asks that women not be forced to choose between public justice and private happiness. Susan Faludi, feminist and writer.
Thank you to the readers, thank you to the persons who originally made those statements, and thank you for listening. May we learn to live towards them. Years ago, my daughter Amanda, who is now in her 50s, I must say, and is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She was then a graduate student in American history, and she saw the title of the ancestor of this sermon, and she phoned me and she says, am I supposed to take this personally? What shall we do with our daughters? Do you have to do something with me? Well, I reassured her that I was speaking about Mary Rice Livermore, a Universalist laywoman of the last century, well actually it was now the last century and one, who wrote a lecture and gave it in many places called What Shall We Do With Our Daughters? She was a famous and popular lecturer, and she talked about how parents should raise their daughters, what they should teach them about the world, how they should help them to take their proper place in the world. So perhaps Amanda was right to take the sermon personally. These questions are still with us today, although our assumptions and expectations have changed, and the issues are somewhat different, and we have made some progress since the 19th century. But despite that progress, women here still have further to go to take their proper place in the world. Why are women still underrepresented in CEO offices, the Oval Office? Well, we've made a little progress there. Boardrooms, STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math. Why do women get a harder time when they're being considered for Supreme Court justice? And we know that women have suffered more career setbacks and have borne most of the burdens of managing family life and education during the pandemic shutdown. Around the world, we know that there are groups determined to keep women from school, to limit their choices in life, to control societies by controlling women. And we know that in the Ukrainian situation, it's the women and the children who have had to leave the country, leaving the men to do another terrible and difficult job. We are no more done with sexism than we are with racism. What shall we do with our daughters? How can we raise them so that they will hear and speak with their own inner voice? Harvard psychologist Carol Gilligan researched the ways in which women grow up, how intelligent, bold, and ambitious girls often learn to silence themselves in adolescence, seeking acceptance. I am familiar with this process. I remember all through my college and young adult years understanding, without ever actually articulating it, that a conversation among just women wasn't real. Discussion didn't count unless men were involved. And then you have to be careful what you said. How did I get this idea? Raised by liberal Unitarians who valued their daughters, who set no limits on our career aspirations, who struggled to send me to a first-rate women's college that they could not well afford. How did I keep this notion, educated at that school, which was and still is a bastion of feminism? It is something deeply embedded in the culture, and it took me decades to find my voice. Gilligan writes about voice. To have a voice is to be human. To have something to say is to be a person. But speaking depends on listening and being heard. It is an intensely relational act. And by voice, I mean something like what people mean when they speak of the core of the self. Voice is natural and also cultural. It is composed of breath and sound, words, rhythm, and language. And voice is a powerful psychological instrument and channel, connecting the inner and outer worlds. Mary Livermore found her voice early and used it to great effect. She was born Mary Ashton Rice in 1820. She was a contemporary of Clara Barton and Susan B. Anthony, but she was born to a strict Boston Calvinist Baptist family. Her parents believed and taught their children that some souls were elected by God from the beginning of time and that others were doomed to hell. Mary and her sisters were expected to read the Bible cover to cover every year from the age of 6. They had a strictly enforced Sabbath. No work, no play, only long church services, Sunday school, and Bible reading to fill the day. When Mary was 8, her father caught her reading Robinson Crusoe on a Sunday afternoon. The book went directly into the fire. Her parents' greatest hope for their children was that they would escape the fires of hell, a fate which they believed awaited the vast majority of the human race. Nevertheless, her parents were loving people and her childhood happy, except for that cloud of religious anxiety that hovered constantly over her life. Religion dominated even her play. She often played minister out in the woodshed, preaching to a congregation of wooden sticks and logs. She and her siblings often staged an elaborate play of the resurrection. This play began with an illness, and then a deathbed scene, a dolorous funeral, with Mary as the minister, of course, and a slow procession upstairs to the tomb, which was a cold, clean fireplace blocked off by a fireboard. There they left the corpse and returned downstairs mournfully. Then came the trumpet call. The so-called dead child would break free from the confines of the tomb, knock down the fireboard, and emerge in a stunning resurrection, followed by songs of triumph. Her father often said that if Mary had been a boy, he would have educated her for the ministry. When Mary was a little girl, she lived in constant fear for her sister's ultimate welfare. She often awakened her parents in the middle of the night, asking them to pray that the other children might become good women and be saved in heaven. As to herself, she answered, "'Tisn't any matter about me. If they are saved, I can bear anything." When a new baby was born, she urged her parents to send the baby back to God for fear that she was not among the elect. She loved another younger sister, long an invalid, as sweet and as kind as Beth in Little Women. But when this sister died suddenly, before she had undergone a conversion experience, her parents knew that the child was unsaved and would go to hell. They quietly accepted this fact, but not Mary. Mary wept and raged and declared that she would rather find herself in hell with this good sister than in heaven without her, with a God who would damn such a kind person to unending torment. This heartfelt declaration was shocking to her parents and the pastor. It is not entirely surprising, then, that as a young adult, Mary Rice finally rebelled. It could not have been easy. Despite the depressing narrowness of her parents' religion, she found the courage to say yes to life, as our hymn number 6 puts it. We'll hear that later. She asked for an education, which her father arranged at the Charlestown Female Academy. But after she graduated and taught languages there for a year, she defied her parents' will, and she went off alone to Virginia, where she spent several years as a governess. Her first-hand acquaintance there with the institution of slavery made her a firm and lifelong abolitionist. Returning eventually to Massachusetts, she became the village schoolmistress in Duxbury. It was a lonely Christmas Eve that set her on a long walk, still burdened by a grim religious heritage. Mary's family did not acknowledge Christmas. It was considered too popish and far too frivolous. Mary walked towards the beach, torn up from the effort of always hiding her anxiety and her discontent, of maintaining a happy front and for family and friends. As she walked past the Universalist church, a joyous hymn spilled out into the raw, cold sea air, along with the light and warmth of a happy Christmas service. The ushers opened the door to let in some latecomers. Mary hesitated. Her family had a poor opinion of Universalists. A faith that did not warn people about the threat of hell seemed to lead them directly to that endlessly burning lake. Despite her misgivings, she joined the crowd and heard a sermon unlike any she had ever heard before, a sermon about love and forgiveness and hope. Intrigued, she asked the minister if she could borrow his manuscript so that she could read it more carefully. One thing led to another. Mary read the sermon. She borrowed some books. She began to work out her own theology, and she read the Bible in a new light. All of this took weeks and months of conversation with the Reverend Daniel Livermore, and ministerial boundaries were not quite in those days what they should be now. They must have discussed a wider range of topics than Universalism and Calvinism. Love and hope bloomed together. The next year, Daniel and Mary were married. For this outrageous choice, Mary Livermore was cut off from her family, but she and Daniel were happy together and enjoyed a long and fruitful marriage. It was within the context of this marriage that Mary Ashton Rice Livermore found her life's work. Aside from raising 2 children together, she and Daniel shared their deepest values. Together they worked for temperance, the abolition of slavery, and women's suffrage, 3 intertwined courses of the reform movement of the day. Daniel eventually left parish ministry. It seemed that his strong stands on these political issues were too much for the more conservative members of his congregations. Daniel bought and edited the New Covenant, a Universalist newspaper in Chicago. Mary, who was long a writer for denominational publications, became the associate editor. And as Daniel's work often took him away from home and office, Mary was the de facto editor and reporter. She was the only woman journalist who covered the nomination of Abraham Lincoln for president. And together they made the pages of the New Covenant ring with the causes of social reform, always basing their work on the principles of Universalist Christian ethics. During the Civil War, Mary took on a more demanding job. She and another Universalist laywoman were the 2 main associates of Dr. Henry Bellows, who was also a Universalist. He was head of the United States Sanitary Commission. The commission was the clearinghouse for the care and relief of soldiers. The military provided soldiers only with the basics, and not always enough of those. Invalid supplies, medical gear, warm socks, little treats, ale, eggs, lemon, codfish, condensed milk, tea, butter. All of these things were provided not by the army, but by the public, with the organizing help of the Sanitary Commission. Mary Livermore's jobs included raising money, keeping records, managing supplies, organizing workers, speaking at rallies, all on an unimaginable scale. It was Mary who proposed, organized, and managed 2 great Chicago fairs that raised over $3 million for relief. $3 million in the 19th century. When Lincoln gave her the manuscript of the Emancipation Proclamation, Mary promptly sold it for $3,000 for the work of the commission. Mary was out in the field as well. She organized poor working girls and patrician matrons in church halls to turn out shirts for the soldiers, 1,000 a day. She arranged transport for wounded soldiers. She often listened to their dying words. held their hands, prayed with them, wrote their final letters. One time, she personally escorted 23 wounded soldiers, bullying military authorities and signing her name, Mary A. Livermore, MD, in order to get permission to bury one who had died en route and had fallen through the bureaucratic cracks. She calmed another dying soldier, sending for a minister to ease his terror of dying in sin. I suspect she could have done a better job of it herself. Mary was never ordained, but she practiced ministry all her life. In her later years, an elderly woman approached her after a lecture and handed her the wedding ring. This woman and her daughter-in-law Annie had gained comfort for years from the words that Mary had written on behalf of a dying soldier, the woman's son and the daughter-in-law's husband. That letter, now thin and fallen apart from folding and refolding, sewn together and often copied, had been a lifeline for these women. Annie's dying request had been that Mary Livermore should have her wedding ring. Another time while living in Chicago, Mary was called one night to the bedside of a dying young prostitute. Mary offered to call a minister, but the girl answered, "I want you, nobody but you." It was Mary who eased the girl's death with her prayers and her words of comfort. After the war, Mary and Daniel turned to the other great social issues of the day. She established and edited The Agitator, a newspaper for women's suffrage. This paper merged with the Women's Journal with Mary as editor-in-chief in Melrose, Massachusetts. Her work as an editor led her to the lecture platform. With increasing frequency, she was asked to speak of her work as a reformer. This was at a time when women were not supposed to speak in public. She spoke in secular settings, in schools and political conventions, in theaters and churches, Methodist, Baptist, Unitarian, and Universalist. She spoke in pulpits delivering what was sometimes called a sermon at a time when women were expected to keep silence in public. Mary Livermore was among the top 4 popular speakers in the nation. Over her lecturing career, she gave some 800 temperance lectures and traveled some 25,000 miles yearly. And during the course of her travels, she experienced more than one train wreck, rode in a cattle car and a beer wagon, almost lost her life in a ferry boat fire. She spoke on a range of topics and did not shy away from the controversial. Women of the war, Queen Elizabeth, concerning husbands, the reason why, superfluous women, Harriet Martineau, the moral heroism of the temperance reform, the coming man, beyond the sea, our motherland, the boys of today, and of course, what shall we do with our daughters? Mary Livermore advocated education for all women, married and single, so that they could support themselves. She worked for women's suffrage. She worked for abolition. Much of what she strove for has come to pass. Times have changed. Women vote. Is there anyone here who can remember their mother's first vote? It happened before I was born, and I never asked my grandmother about it. But the gender gap now makes a difference in elections. Women are educated and enter the workforce in great numbers, though there's still a gap in pay and the possibilities for advancement. I talked to many brides and grooms who assume that of course the wife will continue to be an equal financial contributor to the family, and yet that one question remains. What shall we do with our daughters? How shall we keep their voices alive? What shall we teach them about the world? How will they manage to balance careers and families and lives? Given the constraints of family needs and career opportunities, how will they choose? What is realistic? What will disappoint them? How will they find partners who will share their home and outside work in a way that enhances everyone in the family? How will they be who they really are? Mary Livermore did it all when the constraints were far more severe than they are now. She had the advantage of a loving and supportive partner. She overcame her early religious training, which taught her to devalue herself. She began by speaking only for her sisters and came to speak for all women, and indeed for all people, including herself. Her voice was the voice of a woman of power. Here's what one of her biographers, Elizabeth Stuart Phelps, says of her presence on stage. Mrs. Livermore's manner as a speaker is notable for its dignity. She has a deep, rich voice of remarkable compass, capable of filling any audience room, trained and flexible. Mrs. Livermore's personal appearance adds to her power on the platform. She is eminently well proportioned, and one gets a sense of power from every motion. It is doubtful if there is any other public speaker who wins his way or hers into the hearts of their opponents. Many of her audiences disagree with Mary Livermore's views. Few can be found to disagree with Mary Livermore. She knew how to be a person of power, a woman, to speak her mind, to stay connected with people. Phelps writes further in the florid language of the day. It is good to have her power, her wisdom, her influence, and her fame. It is better to have her tenderness, her human happiness, and her home. It is best to know that she's been able to balance these qualities and quantities with a grace which has not fallen short of greatness. In her power, her tenderness, and grace, Livermore nurtured and used her voice, quite literally on the stage and metaphorically in how she lived her life. She lived a life of integrity, speaking and acting in consonance with her values, the values she shared with her husband and her religious community. What shall we do with our daughters? We could do worse than to learn from the example of Mary Livermore. We should raise our children of any gender to have a true voice, a voice of power and integrity. We should raise them to be fully human, fully themselves. We should raise them to live out their values, to speak for themselves in the larger world. We should raise them to use their voice to say yes to life, to live life fully and generously, and to be celebrated along with all the saints. And our closing hymn is number 103, For All the Saints. Extinguishing words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and in our hands until we are together again. Thank you. Be who you are, love whom you will, rejoice in the self you offer the world, work towards a beloved community where all can do the same. And now Carly will give us a postlude, and then, after Eric or Rick has had a chance to turn off the recording, we'll have joys and sorrows so that you can share what's in your life without concern for being recorded.